Okay. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes for people to be able to log into the webinar. So just bear with us for a couple of moments on this beautiful lunchtime on the 3rd of April. So despite all the global economic uh, troubles, it is a beautiful day. So we'll just give it a couple of more minutes, I think, just to let people come in because it's just coming up to past, and then we will start the webinar. Right, I'm just going to kick off because I'm conscious it's coming up to lunchtime. We really appreciate people logging on. So this is our webinar launch of Social Justice Matters, which is our annual socioeconomic review. The link is just about to go live on the website. Susanna's going to put it in the chat anyway, so that all of you will have access to it. And you will get an email after the webinar as well, just with the link and actually a link to the slides and the recording as well. So joining me this afternoon are John McGeady, our CEO, Mansi Rawat, our economic and social analyst, Suzanne Rogers, also research and policy analyst, and Dervla Reid, who's interning with us at the moment. So Social Justice Matters 2025, it is our new socioeconomic review, and would you believe my screen has just frozen? So can anyone else see if the slides are moving on? Because they are not on mine.
That's not moving, Michelle.
Okay,
No.
so my screen has just frozen. So perhaps someone else will share the slides. I'm going to stop sharing. And we did try run this earlier and they did move, but obviously they are not moving now. So look, I'm going to stop sharing. And Suzanne, if you want to actually share the slides.
Okay, bear with me. No. I No. Can people see that?
Yes.
Okay. So we should have start from first slide. No, that's gone wrong again. I'm going to try it again. Bear with me.
Best laid plans. 10 minutes ago, we had tested all of this and it was working
It all works fine.
seamlessly.
Okay, so we should have our screen
Great.
there. Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Suzanne. So unfortunately, your problem is now you're going to have to move the slides along. So next slide, please. So it's our review. The link should be in the chat. We look at how this year we're looking at, I suppose, prioritizing the common good, managing change and fair outcomes. Overnight we've seen a lot of global change, particularly in trade, come about. So, how do we manage these challenges and existing challenges and achieve fair outcomes? We provide independent analysis and policy proposals, and it's a key reference point for social justice and public policy issues. There are 10 policy areas, which you'll see on the next slide. We're not going to go through all of them today. They are income tax, work, housing, health, education, participation, sustainability, the rural development, and the global south. We're actually going to focus on just a few areas today, a background in terms of the common good and public policy, infrastructure, communities, income, services, and resourcing. Those are the areas we're actually going to focus on today. We're not going to go through all 10 chapters for you. So moving on then to, I suppose, the context in which we're situating this year's socioeconomic review, which is the common good in public policy. We're seeing policy change, and we're likely to see a lot of policy change. And I suppose in our work, we would like to see policy proposals and change situated in terms of the common good. So working towards the benefit for everyone in society and ensuring that the well-being of everybody is improved. Those who are currently left behind are, brought up to the standards that we all expect, and that they're not left behind in any sort of future social, economic, or environmental transformation. And really, what we mean by the common good in public policy is, working to the benefit of all, ensuring the most vulnerable are taken into consideration, and being ambitious in terms of what we want for our society in terms of social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, services, planning, resourcing, not just for current generations, but for future generations. So in terms of delivering sort of fair outcomes with a common good perspective in this time of transition, we're looking at things like demographic change. We know by 2050, there's only going to be 2 people of working age for every older person, as opposed to the 4 that's there at the moment. So that presents us with challenges. There's climate challenges, challenge of digitalization and AI. These will all lead to economic and social transformations. And we have to make sure that these transformations are sustainable and that nobody is actually left behind while we do this. And that really does mean addressing some of the current challenges that we have as we make changes to meet new challenges. And I suppose one of the main areas that we really face challenges at the moment is in infrastructure. So I'm going to pass over to Mansi now, who is going to look at infrastructure with a particular focus on housing.
Thanks, Michelle. So as Michelle has already laid out, we will be focusing on housing. And as we're all aware, Ireland has been in the midst of a housing and homelessness crisis for over a decade, and it is only getting worse. I also wanted to give some stats here to lay some context. So over 15,000 people have accessed emergency accommodation as per the latest report, and just over 4,600 of them are children. I think this demonstrates the scale of the problem at hand. Next slide, please. Now, to set the context for key housing challenges, I think one of the major ones is population expansion and demographic change. Ireland's population is projected to increase to 6.5 million by 2057 under a moderate scenario. And under the same scenario, the number of people aged 65 years and over are expected to grow to 1.9 million, which is going to be 28% of the total population. And this growing and aging population needs adequate housing. This brings us to the next point, that is, housing stock has not kept in pace with the population growth. The Housing Commission's report, which was released last year, estimates a pent-up demand for up to 256,000 homes, and that's before we even take into account future demand or inward migration. And this gap has fueled increases in rental as well as house purchase prices, also resulted in overcrowding, which was pointed out in the report by Housing Commission, and contributed towards homelessness. Finally, social housing needs remain acute. Nearly 59,000 households are on social housing waiting list as of 2023. This does not include those in have tenancies that are being accommodated in private rental sector, nor does it account for people experiencing hidden homelessness, including those staying with families and friends, or this also does not include rough sleepers, or homeless families temporarily accommodated in housing owned by their local authority, women and children in domestic violence refuges, or asylum seekers in transitional accommodation. Next slide, please. So the question remains, what needs to change? And to truly resolve this crisis, we need to rethink how we deliver housing. First, we need the right type of supply. We need to focus on quality, affordability, sustainability that meets long-term needs. And this brings us to the next point, which is a life cycle approach to housing delivery and town planning. Housing should take into account the entire life cycle of individuals within communities, from young adults to older people to those with disabilities. And this approach would see the adoption of universal design principles and development of housing responses, as well as town planning. This would also recognize the importance of upgrading older housing stock to meet contemporary standards. The next point is on addressing affordability at its source. That means reducing construction costs, and waiving some or all construction levies for developers with conditions ensuring cost savings are passed to buyers is one of the main ones. We can also open up procurement so that developers could come together to bid for materials and buy in bulk, thereby reducing unit costs. And the National Housing Procurement Strategy, as mentioned in the program for government, should be central to enabling this approach. In addition, modern methods of construction can play an important role in addressing affordability. To support this, we recommend decentralizing social housing construction to local authorities, enabling them to become anchor clients. We believe that this would provide the scale and stability necessary to make modular and off-site construction financially viable and reducing costs and improving delivery efficiency. And finally, increasing social housing stock to 20% is key to ensuring affordability. Ireland's social housing supply is around 9%, which is far below many of the European peers. And while the commitment to deliver around 12,000 new social homes in the program for government is positive, it is important to note that past targets have often been missed. And this target also remains insufficient to address the ongoing needs of over 115,000 households. And addressing these challenges requires addressing these challenges requires systemic change, strategic planning, and commitment to long-term housing policies. And with that, I will now pass it over to my colleague, Suzanne, who will talk about community.
Super. Thanks, Nancy. The community, it's a very short word, and in the book, when you read every word of it on every page, as I know you will, this encompasses pretty much everything: libraries, parks, swimming pools, access to advice, access to legal representation, digital skills, financial education, to be free from any type of abuse directed at any facet of your being or personality, and to be free to be able to debate and question. It's about local shops, it's about the nighttime economy, it's about tourism, all of those things. Everybody on this call is already familiar with all of these stats. I suppose it's a population that's growing, it's increasing in diversity. If we are really to support cohesive communities, and I'm very conscious that this is something that's going to be a bigger and bigger part of the conversation in Ireland as we move forward, we are really going to have to invest. And again, I just want to really reiterate that word. People talk about costs. We need to be investing in our communities. We need to be ensuring that deliberative democracy is a reality for many, many people. Obviously, we're big fans of the PPN. We're very involved in their work and that sort of participation at local level. So really, the future funding in Ireland needs to really concentrate on engaging communities, on making sure that our health and well-being is being looked after. It's not just about GDP. And I know I can say that the day after Liberation Day, but it's not just about GDP or GGB or, GNI star. It's about our health. It's about our well-being. It's about reducing loneliness in our society, in our communities. It's about capacity building for engagement. It's about funding for communities. So again, there's a massive amount in the book. There's chapters on all of this. But it's just that core thing that, again, as I've said before, we live our lives locally. It has to be about who we're living with and what opportunities are available to us and what supports we have available as well on our doorstep. We are in the middle of a myriad of transitions, and I'm going to quote here from the Draghi report that he says that Europe should learn from the mistakes that were made in that phase of hyper-globalization and prepare for a fast-changing future. And with each year that I get older, it feels that it's getting quicker and quicker and quicker. We're moving online. We have a green transition, we have a demographic transition, we have this digital transition. And the Draghi report also recognised that technological progress and social inclusion do not always go together. Major transitions are disruptive, and inclusion hinges on everyone having the skills that they need to benefit from digitalization. So it's really important that we are getting the services and the access to those services that we need at a local level. So I'm going to move on then. I suppose that link between inequality and social cohesion leads me nicely into my next topic, which is income. And again, everybody on this call knows these figures off by heart now. These are the most recent Silk figures. I suppose they show, I think, the disconnect between reality and the rhetoric for many in Ireland. Headlines are always a country at full employment. Headlines are always a country with a budget surplus. We had this incredible economic recovery post-pandemic, and yet we have statistics like this in Ireland in 2025, which is just it's extraordinary. I'm conscious this is being recorded, otherwise I might be using different words, but it is absolutely extraordinary that in a country with this much economic wealth, that we still aren't able to distribute that correctly. And again, very conscious going forward that our aging and growing population will result in increasing social protection costs at a time, especially today, I think, when system pressures are high. So we really need to be very, very, very careful, very cognizant about how we address poverty and income adequacy. For a lot of people in poverty, they are employed, which again doesn't make sense because the answer to poverty is always go get a job. But we really need to be looking at precarious employment, the types of contracts that are out there, underemployment, which is people who work part-time when they would like full-time hours. That's another conversation about housing and childcare and transport and caring duties. So we have a problem in this country with the working poor. Um, Work and disability, again, we are a country in Europe with the lowest levels of people with disabilities, disabled people in work. And again, for Social Justice Ireland, really, really important that work and employment are not the same thing. There are many, 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 many of us who are very, very, very busy, and it's not always about being in paid employment. So that's just really, really key to get that in there. So for us, it's a real conversation about what a minimum social floor would look like. We need to benchmark social welfare rates. We can see that in the recent silk figures and the deprivation figures that anybody who's reliant on a social welfare income is being left behind as prices are continuing to rise, even if inflation is slowing down. You and I, everybody here knows that the cost of our weekly supermarket shop has not gone down. Um, we would be setting the benchmark at 27.5% of average weekly earnings. A living wage would really be important, and refundable tax credits will really be important. And if I can just quote, I mean, we've had the silk figures, we've had presentations as well again this week from the ESRI about households living in poverty that, you know, a lot of it would seem, I suppose, intuitive that if you are on a fixed income, you're either having to go without the basics, you're cutting back on basics, or you're borrowing, you're getting into debt, you're having to make what they called high risk choices for that. And again, you know, recent research done by Alan Barrett of the ESRI, you know, he stated very clearly, based on the research that he did, that money is the answer to poverty. The key to solving poverty lies in financial support. So again, if we are going to have an equal Ireland, somewhere where everybody can flourish in this, you know, I suppose a country now where there are opportunities. People travel all across the world for opportunities that are available to them in Ireland. So what we really need to be doing is supporting people to be able to cross the road, to be able to access those same opportunities. So it's really careful about how we design our systems going forward. So again, the book is 300 and odd pages of lots and lots and lots of ideas for government. I'm going to pass back now to Michelle to take us through the next section. Thank you. Are you on mute, Michelle?
Of course, I'm on mute. Thanks very much, Suzanne. I'm going to look at services briefly, primarily health and education. So in terms of healthcare, then Suzanne already mentioned we have a growing and aging population. So how do we provide care for a growing and aging population at a time when it looks like potentially there are going to be more pressure on our resources, and there's certainly some volatility in terms of the amount of resourcing we're actually going to take in. So the next slide then is just going to highlight I suppose some key priority areas for us. Ultimately, I mean, Sláintecare, I think it's 8 years now before it was agreed by an all-party committee in the Oireachtas, and progress really seems to have stalled, for want of a better word. So we really would like, I suppose, a recommitment to Sláintecare from the new government, a particular focus on, fully rolling it out, fully resourcing it with a full staff complement as well, so that the regional health areas and the community health networks within those areas have a full staff complement to be able to deliver the services required by the population in those areas. So that means, ensuring that people can access where at all possible the services that they need in a primary care and social care setting so that people aren't being forced to go to the acute hospital setting in their first port of call. Obviously, if you're looking at care in terms of particularly an older population, we need to look at how we provide home care and home help hours and how we implement that, how we consider that, how we resource it. We already know there's ongoing challenges in terms of the number of people who require support in terms of home care and the limited number of hours that are available to them. And we also need to look at some long-term planning and resourcing within the healthcare system as well in terms of is funding being used appropriately at present? A lot of money does go into our healthcare system. Can this money be diverted to, I suppose, the correct parts of this system? And how do we look at a recalibration in terms of increased funding going into communities and community care so that we take the pressure off the acute health system and an acknowledgement, that type of funding will be ongoing, particularly if you're looking at the staffing of the services that are required now and the services that will be required into the future. It obviously raises questions about that population-based health planning and how that budgeting is going to be done in the longer term. The other area, I suppose, that's we're hearing a lot about at the moment, and there was a sleep out outside the door last night, is access to education and education itself. So education goes across the life cycle, obviously, from childcare, early childhood care and education, into primary, second level, further higher education, and skills across the life cycle for particularly those who may meet green and digital challenges. So one of the things within the programme for government that we really welcomed was a commitment to skills, but also a commitment to the reduction of the pupil-teacher ratio to 19.1 across the lifetime of this government. This is something we've advocated for a long time. We look forward to seeing it progress, but really we would like to see a more ambitious target getting to about 17.1 to really address that sort of persistent educational disadvantage and outcomes for young people who attend DESH schools as opposed to their peers who don't. Looking at skills itself then and skills strategies, we are facing challenges in terms of how we move to a green economy, what's considered a green job, who's going to be most impacted by those changes, and who is going to be most impacted by changes in terms of the use of technology in our work. And we have to make sure that we can deliver skills on a place-based basis, use our ETBs properly, ensure that everyone can access that skills. Not everything can be done online. Can we do some more on-the-job training? And how do we ensure that we reach those who need it most? And also make sure that we reach those who are currently underrepresented within the education system, both in higher education and in terms of skills and training. Because if we don't target those groups now, they will find themselves again left behind in terms of transitions, and they won't feature in the discussions around those transitions. Which brings me neatly onto the topic of sustainability and the challenges we face in meeting our legally binding targets by 2050. And someone brought it to my attention on Monday that it's the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and at the time it was it was a very ambitious agreement. We're 10 years on, and it looks highly likely that we're going to miss the target. And and we see changes, I suppose, globally and nationally in terms of emissions, in terms of emissions ambitions, and in terms of the challenges we face. It's also, so 2030 are, I suppose, the deadline for the Paris Agreement and the global goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So in 5 years, we do have a lot of really, really heavy lifting to do. So in terms of the sustainability agenda, how do we promote it and meet our climate targets in a fair way? Because we do have a lot of heavy lifting to do sectorally. There's a lot of heavy lifting, and even within sectors, there's some very difficult conversations to be had in terms of, who's going to feel the most pain. I suppose, first of all, we should be aligning our goals, economic, environmental, and social, and making sure one does not take precedence over the other, and ensuring that we've policy coherence. So, our economic policy, and I suppose now in terms of the current instability around global trade, we really have to ensure that whatever strategies we begin to pursue to, I suppose, mitigate against the worst impacts of that, also support the progress towards the climate targets we've set ourselves. A key priority for us would be the integration of climate adaptation into the budgetary process. We think that will be key in terms of seeing is money being best spent, what are the positive outcomes for that, and can we track. We talk a lot about cost, but it is an investment, and we'll be able to track, I suppose, the environmental, social, and economic benefits of this investment. We should be looking at mitigation and transition, particularly for different cohorts and communities that will be very potentially negatively impacted. And really we also need to consider I mentioned earlier that those groups who are underrepresented, we need to consider them here as well. So, for example, those groups who are currently underrepresented in the labour force, people with disabilities, for example, or different ethnic minorities, because if we don't address the barriers they face now, they're actually not going to feature in, I suppose, the discussion and research that is currently ongoing about the potential employment impact of the coming transition, because they don't feature prominently within the labour force at the moment. And those are things we really have to consider if we're going to, I suppose, deliver on the promise of the just transition where government is committed to, and the climate action plan to promoting skills, ensuring the impact is socially equitable, that existing inequalities are not exacerbated, that our transition is evidence-based and there's engagement and dialogue. And to do that, we do have to make sure to look at it in a holistic way. And the first pillar of that should be aligning actually our national goals to make sure they're supportive of each other. And I'll pass on now to Mansi, who's going to look at the issue of resourcing.
Thanks, Michelle. So in terms of resourcing, as my colleagues have highlighted earlier, meeting the needs of our people living in the society and the growing and aging population, whether in terms of housing, healthcare, or other public services, or in terms of other infrastructure, it requires more than just policy commitment. It requires sustained strategic investment. And the current total taxation levels rely heavily on short-term revenue linked to full employment, consumptions which are linked to short-term cost of living supports, and windfall gains from a small number of multinational corporations in the pharma and tech sector. And this reliance leaves our current tax base exposed to economic shocks and international taxation and trade reforms, such as the one announced yesterday. And although pharma is exempted from it for now, that could change. So we need to move towards a population-based target to increase the overall tax take. If we do that, Ireland's overall level of taxation should reach 26,800 per capita in 2025 terms, which could generate an additional revenue of 28 billion per annum. And this would provide a stable revenue source for public investment. So now the question remains, how do we do it in a sustainable and equitable way? Next slide, please. So first, we need to future-proof our tax system. That means broaden the tax base to ensure resilience, reduce dependence on volatile corporate tax receipts, and plan now for the investment and services we know we'll need. To do that, we would require targeted reforms to increase revenue sustainably. And some of the proposed reforms include reviewing and restructuring tax expenditures to eliminate inefficiencies, ensuring fairness in corporation taxes, ensuring PRSI is increased in a structured and progressive way to strengthen the social insurance fund. And while we acknowledge the efforts that have been made in this direction, we feel they're not robust enough. And reforms such as the job seekers benefit announced recently, these are some of the policies that need to be paid for. And we believe that the best way to do this is to commence a process of increasing and strengthening our social insurance fund. Then introducing a site value tax, also as recommended by Commission on Taxation and Welfare, would be a better alternative than the current value-based local property tax. And this would also lead to more efficient use of land. We also need to increase levies on vacant homes and underused land to address landholding and the current housing crisis, tax on windfall gains, especially those arising from rezoning, consider introducing a financial transactions tax, and ensuring that the carbon tax supports a just transition. Reaching this level would provide a lot more recurring sustainable revenue for the state to invest in public services and improved standard of living for all. With this, I now hand it over to John.
Thanks, Mansi. As you've heard from Michelle and Mansi and Suzanne, Ireland's facing considerable challenges. We're in a period of rapid change and volatility. The emerging trade war with the United States looms very large today. But there are long-standing challenges that stretch back well before the threat of tariffs. Housing, homelessness, poverty, inadequate infrastructure, and so on. At the heart of Social Justice Ireland's analysis is a serious question about fairness. We are wealthier than at any time in our history, and yet almost 630,000 people are living below the poverty line, and well over 15,000 people are in emergency homeless accommodation. We've really failed to harness our wealth in the service of the common good. Now, we believe in large part this is due to the model of development that we followed over many, many years. Now, that model emerged out of hard experience of economic stagnation and emigration, and therefore it's understandable that it prioritizes economic growth and job creation. And there's no doubt that we need a vibrant economy with full employment. But this by itself is not enough. We focused on the size of the economy, and we haven't really got to grips with how that wealth has been distributed across society, either in terms of incomes or the shared services and infrastructure that we all rely on. Next slide there, please, Suzanne. So we're proposing a new social contract that prioritizes the common good, that recognizes that the economy is only one of 5 overarching areas for attention in public policy. Yes, as I said, we need a vibrant economy, but we also need decent services and infrastructure, fair and adequate taxation, good governance, and sustainability at every level of public policy. And we need to be ambitious in delivering on these outcomes. Over the lifetime of the last Dáil, government intervened considerably to support society in response first to the COVID-19 pandemic and then to the cost of living crisis that followed. But interventions to sort of mitigate crises are not enough. The state has to actively shape the future in the interests of the common good. And we've laid out a framework to highlight the policy priorities that are needed to achieve the 5 outcomes that we've listed here. Next slide there, please. So as you can see here on this grid, for a vibrant economy, we clearly need to have financial stability and sustainable growth, but we also have to have decent jobs. And we've heard of the huge numbers of people who are in work and below the poverty line. And we also need increased public investment. In terms of decent services and infrastructure, we need quality services, and we need to have a minimum social floor and population-based planning and investment. To create fair and adequate taxation, as we've heard from Mansi, we need to increase our overall tax take, broaden the tax base, reduce income inequality, and deliver good tax governance. And then in terms of good tax governance more broadly, we have to have open, transparent, accountable structures, social dialogue at both the local and the national level, real participation and deliberative democracy, and reform policy and budget evaluation. And then finally, in terms of sustainability, as has been discussed by Michelle, we need to increase our environmental protections. We need to have a focus on climate justice and a just transition for communities as we decarbonize our society. This is going to need to focus on balanced regional development. And we also need to have adequate and frequent indicators to measure our performance. Next slide, please, Suzanne. So Socialist Ireland believes that to realise this social contract and the necessary outcomes, we require social dialogue involving all stakeholders. This would allow us to respond to the challenges we face both effectively and fairly. It would allow us to identify problems at the earliest stages, and it would facilitate communities and sectors to come to terms with the rapid changes that are taking place and the major transitions that we're facing. Now, an effective social dialogue that engages all sectors of the economy and society would have to involve the employers and the trade unions, organised labour, but also the community and voluntary sector, the farming and environmental sectors, and of course government itself, both at the political and the official levels. We believe that a deliberative process of social dialogue can challenge assumptions about where and how value is created in society. It can find pathways towards alternative policy options, and ultimately can build consensus in support of more sustainable and equitable outcomes for everybody. Now, these outcomes don't just emerge spontaneously, however. Effective social dialogue requires time, investment, and really genuine engagement by government. And that's a core of what we're calling for this year, as we've done over many years. Michelle, back to you.
Thanks very much, John. We will put the link to the publication in the chat. And now it's just over to you. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A function, and I'll get to Suzanne to actually stop sharing the slides as well, so you can see us. So if anybody has any questions, put them in the Q&A, and we'll put the link to the publication in the chat, and you will be getting an email from us as well. You'll probably get it on Monday with the publication, the slides, and the video as well. So actually I have one question that has come in here now, actually from Carol, and it's for you, John. It's around the issue of, I suppose, resourcing and taxation, and she says that perhaps there's more of an acknowledgement now that we do need to maybe generate some more exchequer income to fund the services and infrastructure that we need, given some of the deficits that we have. But she's asking, in light of what has happened overnight, do you think that there's going to be an appetite to look at this? And then are there any kind of particular ways in terms of how government might proceed, given, what we've heard overnight, and also, but then given our reliance on corporate tax, windfall revenues, but the need to actually increase the tax take overall?
Yeah, look, I mean, what's happening with Donald Trump and the trade war is obviously something that we have to be very, very careful about. I suppose our big concern is that it could become a rationale for not making the changes that we need to make, both in our taxation and in investment in services and infrastructure, But we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that we may well see a reduction in revenue from corporation, because that's been highlighted over many years. Okay, like the Department of Finance, the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, the ministers themselves, Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure in recent years, have all acknowledged, that there are significant windfall revenues that we shouldn't become reliant upon, and that we're going to be withdrawn. And even without the global changes to trade that look like are developing now that have been developing over the coming weeks and are going to continue, reforms at the OECD level and the European Union level have meant that we were going to see a withdrawal of corporation tax, and therefore we need to plan for that. So the question isn't so much, can we afford to increase taxation and broaden the tax base? It means that we actually are going to have to broaden our tax base. And I suppose from a social contract point of view, we all contribute to society, and we all therefore have a right to expect to have a decent, adequate standard of living from society. And that costs money. And how we distribute the wealth that we have generated over many years is a question we have to tackle. But if we're going to resource infrastructure and services, if we're going to do so to meet the current need, which is being undermet clearly, And if we're going to meet the future need, which is going to rise through demographic change, we are going to have to raise those funds. And that means that we're going to have to really engage with taxation. Whether or not politicians or policymakers have an appetite for it, it's going to be foisted upon us.
Thanks very much, John. There's another question here, actually, and Suzanne, it is for you. And it goes back to actually some of the research you referenced earlier on. It's a question around the ESRI launched this week. Reference was made to the fact that individual actions to address risky behaviour in terms of borrowing weren't enough. And what systemic changes would you recommend in this instance?
I agree. There was some really interesting stuff came out of that, and I don't know whether I'm putting words in that person's mouth now, but I'm presuming that they're looking at the piece around financial education and financial literacy, which we're all calling for. We have the new strategy launched recently. It's a big part of a lot of the conversations, and what they saw was that our individual knowledge sometimes wasn't necessarily the game changer. So, and I think that really comes down to that income adequacy and that minimum social floor piece. So it's all very well understanding APR. It's all very well knowing how to shop around for the best, there's a lowest interest credit deals or the best deals that are available to you. But if you are on a low income, your options are limited. So I just thought it was really interesting that there's only so much sometimes a low income household can do in that space, because you are straight away into things like poverty premiums. If you can pay your car tax in one go, that's cheaper than paying it in installments. Even buying 4-pack of toilet roll as opposed to a 24-pack of toilet roll, trying to lug these things back from the shops. So I did think that it was that really stood out to me, all right, that it has to be systemic change for those low income households in order to be able to support them to make the best use of their income. And again, what they found again was intuitive, that when your income reduces and your outgoings don't, you're going to have to make difficult choices. But as somebody put it recently, you're making choiceless choices. You don't have a choice. You've got no other way out of this. So I just I mean, again, it just echoes, I think, that call from the sector for benchmarking for adequate levels of social welfare, for extra supports for children, for a cost of disability report. Like, that one particular piece I think can be expanded out to cover all of this. So great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Okay, we have a couple of questions coming in. One is for me, so I'll just answer it first, seeing as I'm chairing. So Colette Nest made recommendations on natural capital accounting last year, and how might these sort of dovetail into the climate adaptation proposal? I think they would dovetail very well. In terms of climate adaptation, that's the money that's allocated to it and what the outcomes are, both in terms of money spent, emissions reductions, improved infrastructure. But the natural capital accounting is more comprehensive, because it looks at the costs of inaction, the costs of, I suppose, degradation of things like your waterways, your air pollution, and so the costs of inaction. So I think both of them together would actually work really well, both in showing the economic, social, environmental benefits of investment, but also the very clear and very large costs of not doing the same. And, a whole lot of work has gone on around that. So I think it would be opportune for government this year to look at how they might begin the process of integrating both of those into the budget process. Now, I have two other questions here. One of them, and Suzanne, I'll put to you. It's around funding in the charity sector. So the question is, funding in the charity sector has received, a lot of public money, but there's no clear audit of the money. And there's also no mechanism for employees to raise concerns with funders when there's poor governance, or there's no transparency in terms of how many reports are upheld in this sector for whistleblowers raising concerns. So our thoughts, but before I hand to you, Suzanne, I suppose in terms of the funding for the community voluntary sector, I will say, everyone has to comply with the charity's regulatory authority, and actually the end of April this year, every charity is going to have to file their annual return on that. Everyone has to have audited accounts. Everyone has to comply with the governance code. So there are a whole lot of, I suppose, standards that, charities, particularly those, all of them, and those in receipt of public funds, do have to adhere to, and all of them should be adhering to. But Suzanne, maybe a comment on the broader issue of funding for the sector as a whole.
There has been a lot of conversation, especially leading up to the last election, about funding for the charity sector, that we consume billions without really understanding that that's universities, that's hospitals, that's schools. So they all fall under that heading. Government relies heavily on the charity sector to do basic government work, which is in the homeless services, in a lot of social care services. So that is public money being spent on public services. I think, really just want to get that across. As for no clear audit of the money, I mean, speaking as you said, Michelle, for ourselves, like the amount of reports and the amount of reporting that you have to do in return for your funding is actually quite extraordinary. So from my understanding, the system as it currently stands, there should be a clear audit system for that money. But this is a lot of the community, and the community as sector, I suppose if you want to call it that charity sector, the community and voluntary sector provides those systems and supports that really should be done through government systems. So the government is funding it maybe at one remove, especially if you look at things like social care staff, if you look at any kind of care that comes out through that system, and their funding hasn't been restored to what it was pre-crash. So I think there's real questions there about even how they can continue to provide the supports that they do, which are vital for communities across the country. And again, what we can see in the budget every year is that the regulators get an increased, they get an increase for their costs every year, but a lot of smaller organisations aren't getting the funding to allow them to spend it on admin costs. So what you're seeing is actually as the admin that comes with governance is increasing, and it is increasing year on year, that's actually putting into funding that should be going directly to service users and service providers. So, if anything, from where I'm sitting, I think that the system, if there are abuses of the system, I suppose that's maybe a conversation for a different space and time, but we're well audited from what I can make out.
Thanks, Suzanne. And actually, that leads me into, so there's another question here from Faye regarding, I suppose, the prominence recently in terms of, teenagers, young male teenagers, all the discussions from that television show some people may have seen, Netflix. But Faye raises a very valid point in terms of funding for youth work and the youth sector and how chronically underfunded it remains. And, their youth is now in the portfolio, Minister Norma Foley's new portfolio, that's welcome. But how do we prioritise youth and youth work? Because obviously it's supporting our future active citizens, as Faye points out. And I know annually we have in our budget proposals looked at increased funding for youth work and youth workers. So Suzanne, do you have any other comments on that, like in terms of the importance of youth work, following on just on the whole issue of funding for public funding and funds that go into the community and voluntary sector?
Well, I mean, it's hugely vital, and Ireland is actually held up as an exemplar across Europe for the professionalisation of youth workers. So we do a really, really good job. We've got a lot of degree level courses here, that it's not just not everybody can just, supposed to go back to the auditing piece and the governance piece as well. Not everybody could just set themselves up as a youth worker or a youth work program. Like, you do have to be qualified to a degree or an honours degree level. So I think the system here in Ireland does function really, really well in that sense. It does seem to be geared more towards, though, maybe, young people at risk, young people on the margins, whereas I know that with extra funding, I think that, because obviously it's youth workers for everybody, you know what I mean? Like, the youth projects try to encourage every single young person in the area to come in and be involved, but they will need funding for that. And again, it is something that we call for year after year after year after year. And even like the Youth Council put a stat out recently from the last homelessness figures, about half of the people who are registered as accessing homeless accommodation in the last, well, when did we get the stats? March, are aged under 24. So, like, there's an untold damage being done to our young people who are just being neglected and left behind. And as I keep saying, like when we look at the data for education and all of that, like we can see there's this cohort that is being left behind, but we know where they are, we know who they are. And again, it will just be about how do we support them in that space. But no, I mean, I'd be a huge advocate of youth work. I mean, I benefited from myself, as a teenager, just spaces to allow you to figure out who you are, how you engage with the world, are absolutely vital. A kind of non-family space, non-structured space, and we seem to be less and less and less of them everywhere you go. So, I mean, I'm hoping maybe that this particular TV program as well will have a good conversation about how we support our young men as well. Because there's been great strides made, I suppose, in gender equality, and yet we have like the highest rates of, suicide, incarceration. They do tend to be young men, so it's definitely a conversation to be had as well in that space. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. So the question there in terms of a dependency ratio and working age population, looking at, alternative ratios and, it being out of step of early school leaving and positive aging. And it's interesting because working on a European report last year, people raised issues around the term old age dependency ratio, because it doesn't, but that's a statistical term. That's what's used at a European level, at a global level. So that's just what we have to work with. And I know the terminology might not be great, and it certainly wasn't appreciated by some of the people aged over 65 who were working on that project, but that is just how things are measured. Mansi, there's a question in here about housing actually, and the question is that the scale of the challenge just seems to be so vast. What are there two recommendations that you would recommend that government should implement in the next 2 years that could actually make an impact in terms of, I suppose, housing availability, affordability, and reduce costs?
Thanks, Michelle. And oh yes, of course. And I think if I want to pin it down to two recommendations, I think one of them would be, and I think it's a major one, which is modern methods of construction. I think government has rightly committed to using modern methods of construction, and it is, and I think the best way to do is to decentralize the responsibility to local authorities so that they can act as anchor clients for social housing. And this is also easier to scale up, and given that local authorities can be anchor clients, it would also give the industry the scale, stability, and predictable pipelines of work, which is exactly what's needed right now. And like Ireland already has off-site manufacturing sites as well as different industries, like for example, County Louth, earlier I think I read about Dundalk, and they were able to deliver a house in 6 months using 3D printing technologies. So I think these are the kind of technologies that we also need to use, so that not only are these built faster, but they also support Ireland's climate goals. And another one, which is in line with this, is that we need to align training and skills development with modern methods of construction so that we ensure apprenticeships and upskilling initiatives are focused on these areas. I think, the program for government does, again, I'm going to refer to it and say that it does commit to new apprenticeships, but I think the scale at which it is required to meet the projected goals is not what it's not ambitious enough. And I think there was a research led by Technological University of Shannon that estimated that we need at least 120,000 additional skilled construction workers, and we need to reskill at least 164,000 workers to deliver housing commitments. So, to ensure that there's a steady pipeline of skilled workers. So I think these two would be the main ones. In addition to that, I would also like to add that we also need to address some systemic bottlenecks in the delivery process. And one of the major ones and the key enabler is the National Planning Framework. as we all know, that it guides the strategic planning and development across the country and feeds into the local area plans and land rezoning. And now it's outdated and does not reflect the new housing target. And without the implementation of the revised version, it is going to be very difficult to secure any kind of planning permissions or rezoning of the land. So I think that should be one of the key priorities, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Mansi. And I'm conscious that we're coming close to the end. Suzanne, there is a question here that you might respond to in terms of social welfare and social welfare increases. The fact that, last weekend, more or less told in the papers that social welfare increases that potentially that are committed to in the programme for government. And I think actually the programme for government is only committed to pensions, may not happen as a result of the impact of what was announced last night. But in terms of what should be happening on social welfare, maybe, as opposed to what they're not going to do, what would you propose?
I mean, at the current, in the SER there, and again, I'm sure everybody's read up as far as chapter 3, that at this particular moment in time, that 27.5% benchmark that we recommend would already see an increase of an extra €22 onto the current rate. So, and that doesn't tip the edge of poverty. It doesn't go anywhere into income adequacy. You know what I mean? Because that's kind of, you're trying to build on that towards your MESL to be able to say, well, what actually do we need in order to be able to provide for a basic basket of goods? So again, what we can see though is as well this week we've had the new pay related social welfare payment has come into effect from Monday, and that's set at a maximum of 450. I think then there can be 375 or 350 as well, depending on your previous contributions. But like that's a real clear indication, I think, and the PUP was a real clear indication that that rate of 244, which I cannot stress enough, is designed or is expected to put the roof over your head, food on the table, the heat on, the light on, your bus fares, your refuse, your personal care, your clothing, your shoes, any kind of insurances, any sort of social inclusion. It would also have to pay for your mobile phone, for your TV license, all of those things out of €244 a week. So that is, it's impossible. Like I don't have a degree in quantum physics, but I reckon I could prove it somewhere in there. So that basic level of income adequacy needs to be set at a realistic level. And I thought it was interesting that the papers at the weekend were, well, it was almost like a preemptive strike before we even knew what the tariffs were going to be, whether they were going to come into play. And this is this year's reason why we can't increase social welfare, because we had a different reason last year, we had a different reason the year before. And yet at the same time, we are a country at full employment. So it is quite a small cohort at the moment who would be on job seekers. And again, it's about investment. If you want to be job ready, if you want to support people back into the workplace, you are actually going to have to provide them with a basic, decent standard of living. So again, I think we're all going to be starting working on our pre-budget submissions, I'd imagine now in the next month. And everybody, I would think across the sector would be calling for at least that to be added to the basic rate.
Thanks, Suzanne. And we've one final question here from Faye. Are we engaging with Gary Stevenson in terms of the wealth tax and the charge and alternative future? I suppose we've been doing that for years in terms of like wealth in Ireland is primarily tied up with property. We've been proposing a site value tax for more than 10 years, a financial transaction tax, also a policy to ensure that very high income earners pay the same income taxes that PAYE earners do, and an elimination of, a lot of the anomalies that exist in the system already. I think if we did some of those things here, particularly the site value tax on rezoning, we've long held out for a minimum effective corporate tax rate, and those issues around SARP, high income earners, that you would see more fairness in the system. But in the Irish context in particular, if you're looking at wealth and wealth tax, those are the areas you need to start, and those are the areas that we've been advocating on for many years. So look, I'm conscious it's 1:30. I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. I really want to apologise for the technical glitches that I can guarantee you we practiced the 10 minutes before. I'll blame my own laptop, and thanks to Suzanne for stepping in and sharing the slides for me to Mansi and to John and to Dervla. And look, we'll be emailing out a link to the publication, to the slides, and to the recording of this webinar to you early next week. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Suzanne, I'll get you to end the webinar now.
Thank you.